Hello, everyone, and welcome. And hello to everyone who is online as well. I'm Virginia Rowthorn. I run the Center for Global Engagement in the Campus Center, and I want to welcome you to Global Hot Topics. This is the last in this year's series on critical issues in global health, social policy, and law. This semester, we've heard from an expert on the violent history of the coffee, tobacco, and sugar trade. We've hosted the director of the Consortium on Universities on Global Health to hear about his perspective on the future of global health. And we've watched a very moving documentary with the filmmaker on defying disability stigma in Kenya. Today's talk fits in perfectly in this vein of cutting-edge work on global health. Professor Matiangai Sirleaf will discuss her research in a talk titled White Health and International Law. Professor Sirleaf is a Nathan Patz Professor of Law at the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law. She holds a secondary appointment as a professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And if we can make our technology work, which it looks as if we can, we are very lucky to have another world-renowned global health scholar as part of this program to respond to Professor Sirleaf's presentation, and that's Dr. Seye Abimbola. Dr. Seye Abimbola is an associate professor at the School of Public Health at the University of Sydney in Australia, where his teaching and research focus on knowledge practices in global health, health system governance, and the adoption and scale up of health systems innovations. His article, Will Global Health Survive Its Decolonization, is one that's made a huge impression on me. And I just want to personally thank you for that article that I've shared many times with colleagues. There will be some time for questions at the end. For those of you online, you can submit your questions anytime. And finally, I want to acknowledge that today's talk is co-sponsored by the Law and Healthcare program here at the law school. So thank you to Diane Hoffman, Rebecca Hall, and Jihan Girgis for their support. So on that note, Professor Sirleaf, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much for that kind introduction. Thank you for being here with me this afternoon. I know that it's a pretty tough season for many reasons. Sorry, I'm looking for the mouse, multiple mice. Yeah, it's a pretty tough season for many reasons. And so I appreciate you taking time to be with me today, to be with us today to talk about a topic that is really near and dear to my heart. And so first, I just want to begin by just acknowledging Indigenous peoples, past and present and future, as the rightful and traditional protectors and caretakers of their native lands in what we now know today as the United States. I recognize the historical, ongoing, and violent legacy of land theft initiated by settler colonialists who first invaded the Chesapeake region in the 17th century. I want to note that the law school in Baltimore sits on the ancestral lands of the Iroquoian-speaking peoples and Algonquin-speaking peoples, all of whom shared this area through their relations and whose descendants are thriving despite settler occupation. I also want to acknowledge the people forcibly kidnapped and sold from Africa, who were enslaved on these lands from the colony's founding in 1634 until 1864, when the state of Maryland abolished slavery. Enslaved Africans were exploited and did work on this land, enabling us to live as we do today. Historical and ongoing systems of oppression have perpetuated and obfuscated acts of political, social, economic, ecological, and racial violence. And acknowledging the fundamental role that these play and continue to play in contemporary harms is something that is vital. And so recognizing these interconnected injustices serves as an opening today for us to contemplate the continuing resistance to subordination in global health. I wanted to begin my talk with this image because it really makes starkly visible how global health inequalities are structured. And it also clarifies the zones of sacrifice that persist, the bodies, the lives, the health, the well-being of the vulnerable, and those on the periphery, those marginalized in society, those that are treated as disposable, those whose lives are rendered irrelevant, in the global South and in the global North. Society treats subaltern peoples the same as we treat waste, thrown away, out of sight, and out of mind. My interest and positionality as I come to this topic was wrought by my own upbringing in Liberia, West Africa. Throughout, I have been concerned with rectifying the inequities that have been visited on people of the global majority. And I remember volunteering at an AIDS orphanage in Kenya in 2002, I believe, and seeing how many children the pandemic had left without parents. I also remember working at the Global AIDS Alliance in 2003 and feeling the futility that I felt about what my advocacy efforts were doing to try to contribute to policymakers and other actors' efforts to try to fund and address infectious diseases like HIV and AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And as I bore witness to the 2014-2015 Ebola epidemic ransacking several West African countries, including my family's home, Liberia, I was driven to undermine simplistic accounts where epidemics like Ebola just happen spontaneously due to local backwardness, where the health and inequalities and vulnerabilities are just sort of rendered natural. And the continent of Africa and its peoples are treated as, again, a waste, as a wasteland, as a place of diseased bodies. And I wanted to disturb that tendency to sort of normalize the suffering and vulnerability that has been associated with diseases that disproportionately impact Black, Indigenous, and other peoples, other subaltern peoples. And so my research then tries to uplift the role that international law plays through both the mission and commission of furthering inequalities and hierarchies. So this talk today will connect how racial and colonial logics are reflected widely across different areas of global health law and policy, and how the past continues to inform the present. The central question that this talk will interrogate is whether and to what extent white health and white interests then and now continue to inform the global health agenda. White health is a concept that I am using to reflect the way that diseases are racialized and constructed socially. That is, diseases are given racial meaning based on the racial groups that are socially constructed as being associated with those diseases. And so I want to be clear that this is nothing about sort of the biological or innate nature of the role that race is playing, but the way in which that race is socially constructed, and the process of racialization constructed racialized peoples as diseased and as inferior. And doing that helps us to do a number of things. It helps us to situate the political, legal, and social privileging and salience that is given to ailments that are thought to touch and concern people who are racialized as white. And so my talk today surfaces the origin of global health, and I'm going to do that. My time is actually just starting now because I just put my timer on. I'm going to discuss the role of exploitation and racial capitalism in the field and how this was formative to the development of the field of global health. And then I'm going to talk about how tropical medicine and the transition from tropical medicine to colonial medicine, tropical medicine / colonial medicine to global health is one that is a fundamental one that we should keep with us, because that is going to help us understand how the global health law regime sort of emerged. And then it'll allow us to explore the ways in which coloniality continues to persist in the field. I'm not going to save the conclusion. So the conclusion and the takeaway, the key things that I want you to walk away from are that despite its ambitions, right, global health law as a field doesn't escape the structural limitations and racial hierarchies imposed by the larger field of international law. The field of global health, in fact, misinforms us significantly about how global health law was developed by looking at the outcome of law as sort of a generation or accumulation of the project, as opposed to a blunting force and one that limits more radical and alternative visions for our health and well-being. And so to better understand the global health law regime, I argue that we need to understand the path not taken, what's been excluded, what's been erased, what's been marginalized. And instead of focusing, as global health law tends to do, on the creation of legal architecture as a good in and of itself, I argue that this provides a really shallow and narrow vision and understanding of both our past and also what potential emancipatory futures might exist for us. So with that, let me turn to now talking about the ways in which the transcription function is messing with my ability to move the slide. So I'll just do that. Nope. Sorry, we thought we were all set. And? Okay, all right, so wait for it. Global health law tends to render invisible the historical and ongoing effects of colonialism, the material exploitation, the function of structural racism, and the like. And so I'll just use one example. The United Kingdom's involvement in the transatlantic trade in enslaved persons alone is estimated to have resulted in harms totaling 24 trillion. You and I are mere plebs, and so we don't really understand what that means or how to make that significant. But researchers have found that between 1960 and 2018, the global north, through unequal exchange, drained from the south 62 trillion, so even more. And this is the period between 2016 and, between 1960 and 2018. And so that continued effect and legacy of extraction continues even in the quote unquote post-colonial moment. In 2015 alone, the global north net appropriated from the south 12 billion tons of embodied raw materials and its equivalent. And so it's important for us to understand the larger structure in which global health sort of exists. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. And we need to wrestle with and grapple with the ways in which global health law sort of assumes global health inequality and inequality more generally as sort of a given. And without making any real effort to sort of address that history and continued legacy of inequality along lines of racial and class subordination. In health, there's this concept called structural determinants of health in public health, right? And so that's a way and that's a concept for thinking about how political, legal, economic structures can inform and influence our health. So our health experience is not just informed by sort of biological things. Our health outcomes and our ability to live a quality life is informed by where we live, the air that we breathe, all of these things you should know from living and being, but the way in which law and policy often responds to health needs is as if we just need sort of biomedical interventions to address things without paying any attention to these sort of larger structures. And thinking about the structural role that colonialism has played, the structural role that racism has played, and the structural role that class subordination has played is important for thinking about any effort to remedy global health inequality. And so here I want to surface then Cedric Robinson's concept of racial capitalism, because I think it does good work in unsettling the seemingly sort of coincidental nature that all of these things sort of happen. The process of racialization, the process of enslavement, the process of colonization, and the like. And in fact, if we understand racial capitalism as informing and telling us, who is disposable? Again, where are the zones of sacrifice? Who are the people that whose labor can be extracted and then thrown away and discarded? This is a helpful framework for then thinking about how and if the racial stratification and class hierarchies sort of continue to do so. And so all of that is helpful for then thinking about how the field of public health developed. And so I want to connect this history to thinking about the ways in which public health developed. I think this quote says it all, so I'm not going to read it. But the point is that the health and well-being of subordinated populations in racialized states was often explicitly tied to racial capitalism, right? It was not about our or your ancestors and foremothers' health for their health themselves. It was about the utility and proximity to white majoritarian interests. And so public health systems developed then because even under systems of medical apartheid, there was a recognition that, okay, well, Black, Indigenous, and other subaltern peoples' health have to be improved to some minimal level of functioning because germs don't actually abide by segregationist logics, right? They don't actually understand the construction of race, the social construction of race, right? So disease-carrying microorganisms are not functioning on racist lines and racist ideologies. And so there is a way in which if you're invested in white health, you then have to be concerned about the health of subaltern peoples, especially at points of convergence where there is connection. So this is a picture of the US and during Jim Crow, despite the hectic apartheid that existed within this country, measles, tuberculosis, pneumonia, typhoid, all of these things were spreading. And that necessitated a public response to the welfare of subordinated groups within this country. And that's just one example of the way in which public health developed to sort of take account of the health and well-being to the extent that it touches and concerns white interests. And so how then does that project get globalized? Tropical and colonial medicine is the name of the field. And that is a key mechanism for translating the priorities of imperial science and policy. Here you see some missionaries. And I want to be clear that the conceptualization of sort of tropical diseases is a misnomer, right? So malaria, cholera, leprosy, dengue, all of these things were endemic in the global north, right? So there's nothing sort of inherently different about the tropics. The disappearance of these diseases in places like Europe and in North America are in large part due to addressing underlying determinants of health in these areas, as opposed to sort of an inherent pathology of the tropical climate or tropical peoples, so to speak. But tropical medicine was a crucial aspect of colonial subjugation and expansion. And so it's important to think about the well-being and health of peoples that were subordinated underneath colonialism was a function of needing their labor for the capitalist machine. And so that is important because, again, your health and well-being is not a good in and of itself. It's good to the effect that it impacts the bottom line. And so this sort of integral relationship between colonialism and tropical medicine is important to think about because in many ways, the colonial administration was necessary to help, and the coercive power of the colonial administrative state was necessary to implement different interventions. This is inoculation taking place in India. And so tropical medicine was generative for colonialism, right? So I want to be clear that this nexus between sort of wealth extraction and the health of peoples is integrally linked, and that it was important for imperialism that troops be able to better cope with unfamiliar diseases, that they needed to be healthy in order to subjugate peoples, in order to take over lands that they claimed were theirs, and in order to be able to suppress those fighting against colonial domination and subjugation. And so the field of tropical medicine focused on infectious diseases, vector-borne diseases, and infectious disease control. And so that legacy is key, and it's an important one for us to continue to think about because there is a way in which the diseases that are thought to touch and concern the interests most of capital, white majoritarian interests in the North, and have the most significance for the expansion of colonial empires tend to sort of get elevated in global health. And so I want us to trace and track the ways in which communicable diseases and the effect of communicable diseases, or importance rather, continues to be this sort of clear legacy. And the ways in which that racialized territories and racialized peoples then continue to be marked as places of difference even when they're not in, the particular territories. And again, the field is created to make the region and its peoples more hospitable to European extraction. And the field then is necessary for transforming this otherwise quote unquote backward region and the like. And so I want that those trains of thought to stay with us. And now I want to do like a very quick and dirty on international law, and I'm happy to answer any questions, but I want to make clear the role that international law is playing as sort of a structuring force. So international law is a fundamentally oppressive body of law because it says that only states can make law, and only some peoples were allowed to be states. And surprise, the people of the global majority were not, and their sovereignty were not recognized as sovereigns. So they were not able to make international law. And treaties, that's international conventions, only states can make those. And P.S., most of you peoples are not involved in the project of lawmaking. So, and that the treaties are sort of the first form of lawmaking. The second form, both of these are sort of state-driven, is based on international custom, again, by states, right? And again, most peoples are outside of what's considered as states. And so international law then perfects racial hierarchy. It perfects class subordination, and it ratifies this undemocratic form of lawmaking. And you can think of treaties as sort of contracts and custom as sort of behavior that people are doing out of a sense of a legal obligation. Both of these are primary sources of law. The reason why I have custom highlighted is because custom is made by the general practice of states, and those states who are most affected are the ones who get to keep the rule. So meaning if a bunch of new states come along and say, hey, we want to change that rule, it doesn't serve us, the most affected states have to say, okay, yes, I agree. And the most affected states, you might guess, are going to say, hey, no, by the way, I don't agree. So that means it's a very hard body of law to change, and it builds the structural inequities are sort of built in to the field. And then when you look at the other sources, I won't spend too much time on them because they're subsidiary sources. But what I want to flag is just the way in which the coloniality of the doctrine just sort of jumps out, right? So it's only the general principles of civilized nations, right? So international law constructs people as civilized, and then other peoples are not. And those people who are outside of civilization, their lands, their rights, their legal systems, you can just disregard. It's as if they were not even there. So this is the legal fiction on which international law is built. And then in the context of the transatlantic trade in enslaved African peoples, the communities of descendants of enslaved peoples get spread all about in different places. And that means that the lawmaking power that might have existed gets even more restricted because there's some dilution that's happening. And of course, all of the indigenous people's lands and rights who were subordinated through the process of colonialism and settler colonialism don't get a say in sort of the lawmaking. And when the law is made, like I said, it's really hard to sort of change and amend. And so that's the primer that you need to know for international law. I won't necessarily spend too much time on the last one, which is just saying that if courts are confused about the different sources, they can look to judicial opinions of the most highly qualified publicists, and that is considered, likely considered those from civilized nations, quote unquote, even though the doctrine doesn't say that. So that's sort of how international law works, right? It's a state-centric doctrine. And so I want us to understand that at a period where empires were fighting for territory, for expansion of their empires, they were also meeting regularly between 1851 and 1938. This is the height of European imperial expansion. And they are fighting elsewhere, but they're meeting on global health. And that must be because they are humanitarians and they really care about the health and well-being of others. Or imperial powers recognized that they needed to coordinate their actions because they needed to prevent certain diseases, and they used the vehicle of international law to do that. So 13 international agreements concerning collaboration on health control measures in the first part of the 20th century get sort of negotiated. And this serves as the foundation of the global health regime. And it's important to start with this foundation because I think a lot of times those who are in the field of global health like to begin sort of with the World Health Organization creation and thereafter. But this colonial history and legacy is important because it surfaces a couple of things. Again, tropical medicine prioritizes infectious diseases, and so global health then prioritizes infectious diseases, in particular infectious diseases. Most of the regulations that are negotiated put quarantine regulations that would restrict and impede the unmitigated expansion of imperial trade. And so the purpose then of global health law is to stop diseases from racialized territories, racialized people, from impacting the center, from impacting the mother country, and so on and so forth. And so that fundamental dynamic is one that is an important one to think about because defensive measures against these diseased territories, diseased peoples is an ongoing legacy of global health. And one of the leading French voices during the international sanitary conferences talked about defending Europe against exotic diseases. And we don't have to think too far to continued political rhetoric that continues to scapegoat racialized peoples as diseased and a need to like defend the border and so on and so forth. And so I will not belabor all of the different conventions, but I just want to say with broad strokes, the treaties would name given diseases that were touching and concerning the center, mainly Europe and the Americas, North America. And then they would say, okay, we need to put these regulations in place that would be travel restrictions, trade restrictions, and the like. And the relevance or irrelevance of named diseases, again, were based on the health priorities of white majoritarian interests within the global north. And it's not as if there were no other diseases that were afflicting populations globally. It's not as if there were the mortality and quality of life stats of other diseases were irrelevant, but the way in which the regime developed was, prioritize this particular disease. For example, cholera was prioritized because there was some concern that the Suez Canal could be a conduit for the introduction of cholera from India to Europe. And so diseases sort of fall onto the list and fall off the list as and when they touch and concern these interests. And so this is one of the many sanitary conferences that took place. And again, I want to point out that at the time of the World Health Organization's founding, 750 million people, about a third of the world's population, were subject to colonial domination and rule. The World Health Organization is supposed to be global, and it includes, its constitution states, the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is one of the fundamental rights of every human being without distinction of race, religion, political belief, economic or social condition. So the WHO's foundational principles indicate then that this privileging of white interests and the like should be less central underneath this regime. And since the inception of the organization, the question has been whether it can make a clean break from its colonial legacy. Briefly, regulations and sanitary conventions are all names just for treaties, which I talked about earlier. And there were several revisions. One of the major or significant revisions involved for moving from the international sanitary regulations to the international health regulations of 2005. That regime governed until most recently in 2024 when they were revised. But what I want to point out about the global health regime and what I want you to understand and take away is that against this background, against the background of colonialism, of class hierarchies, of structural racism, and inequity, global health law can protect, it can overprotect, it can fail to protect, but it is not and cannot be neutral. right? So global health law reflects the choices and practices of states, as I've said, and other actors as well. And that includes both action and inaction. And so inaction or silence on the part of global health law to address inequality is ratification of the status quo of coloniality, of class exploitation, of structural racism in health. And so global health law then has reified the subaltern positions of many Black, Indigenous, and other subaltern peoples who lacked lawmaking power internationally, some nationally and regionally as well, and were not historically able to translate their health priorities into law. And then following independence, we're not easily able to translate their health priorities into law because of the way in which I told you international law is really hard to sort of change. So then the period of decolonization happens. We're like moving rapidly along. The period of decolonization happens, and there are newly independent countries who have fought for their liberation and are now seeking to reshape the world in more equitable ways. The non-aligned movement of states, founded in 1961, brings together countries from Asia, from Africa, from the Americas, from the Middle East, to advance their interests and priorities through a so-called new international economic order. Their advocacy efforts lead to this conference that takes place in 1978, and it calls on the World Health Organization to stop this focus on specific disease interventions that predominated during colonial and tropical medicine and continued to predominate after the World Health Organization's founding, to a focus on primary healthcare. And I want to just show some of the provisions, and I want to be clear, this is non-binding. And so one of the things that I want to make clear is that the health and rights priorities are articulated, but they don't get made into law. So this is an example of an attempt to try to change the framework. So it's non-binding, it's not a legal document, but it's a statement of priorities, and it's an important one for us to think about because one, it tells us about the importance of primary health care. Two, it talks about community action. Three, it talks about determinants of health, that concept I was telling you all about, outside the health system. And it talks about the governmental role in health provision and the governmental role and responsibilities to people within its territories. And it stresses a redistributive agenda, right? So the gross inequality within health status of peoples in the global South as contrasted against the global North. But I want to be clear that even within the global North, there's stratification within that region as well, that one, it's unacceptable, it's a common concern, and that something needs to be done about it. And that it is actually possible to remedy health inequality, right? It's not something that we have to accept as a given. It's not something that's natural. It's something that's structural, and it's something that can be changed. And it talks about how we might change that. And it makes clear that health for all is attainable and that budgets are statements of our values. And so if we reordered our militaristic priorities, for example, and dedicated them to health and other social and economic needs, that would improve health outcomes throughout the world. And it talks about the need to reshape what are called sort of commercial determinants of health, or like I was just talking about, racial capitalism, right? That we have to account for the function of law and political economy and the constraints that serves on trying to change health. And so this is an important moment because it serves as an important effort to try to destabilize global health and to challenge entrenched commercial interests. It, of course, faced resistance from states within the global North. The declaration didn't substantially change the World Health Organization's policy in the short, medium term. It changed sort of its lip service in terms of prioritization of public health. But instead, donor states who donate to the World Health Organization and elsewhere narrowed their contributions to the World Health Organization. and instead focus on things like biomedical interventions for particular diseases, which sounds really familiar to colonial medicine and tropical medicine that we were talking about, and something called selective primary healthcare. So that is a completely different and diametrically opposed vision to the one advanced in the Declaration of Alma Ata. And I want to pull out, if I can, the role of institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, because these financial institutions and basically the neoliberal sort of economic agenda, which prioritizes austerity for some places through structural adjustment reforms, means that many nations, in order to get access to loans, they have to limit their health spending, to limit the amount they food subsidies they put, limit investments in other social sectors, education, so on and so forth. This obviously has detrimental health consequences. It shrinks what is already a small public health space to one that is more negligible. And we should note that countries, including the one we're sitting in, regularly engage in deficit spending. It's like, oh, we'll just add another zero to the check and we'll just continue adding, right? So this idea that other people's budgets need to be balanced is a fiction. And the first priority in terms of paying is to your external creditors. And it's like, well, who wrote that rule? The creditors. The creditors wrote that rule. We get paid first. And then everything else, I'm not sure about everything else, but we get paid first. And that's how you balance your budgets. And so there's an inordinate focus then on implementing these neoliberal reforms in a number of different countries, which have undercut efforts to build capacities in health systems and have generated substantial challenges for redressing global health inequalities and a number of other things. For those of you who've seen this recently in the news, Kenya, there are a bunch of political protests because of IMF programs recently and resistance to IMF programs recently. So this continues. I don't want to make it seem like it's just the 1980s. These programs continue and they have multiple effects. And so now I want to just turn quickly to thinking about the current moment where we are. So the international health regulations that I mentioned earlier say, okay, well, we need to get implemented, and they don't contain anything about redistribution. They don't contain anything about addressing this historical legacy and undoing it or anything on the face of that. And so it's as if the lived realities of subordination and structural determinants of health that we've talked about just don't exist. So the structural conditions get backgrounded, and states are supposed to get health capacity somehow, and it's a legal obligation. So they're just supposed to develop better functioning health systems. And again, this is against the background of budgetary and financial restrictions that say to do the opposite. And so these regulations, again, are identifying sort of where the zones of sacrifice and which lives are rendered vulnerable to health shocks and the like. And so this regime was unsatisfactory prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the COVID-19 pandemic really just served as a portal for a number of things. And so very briefly, the COVID-19 pandemic showed the ways in which decisions continue to be informed by outdated but persistent settler and colonial conventions that have mapped illness and diseases onto racialized people and certain geographic regions. And we saw this throughout the pandemic. And I'm just showing you some of the most visceral ones. This one in particular is the literal racialization of diseases that I was talking to you about as like a metaphor. And I didn't think when I was writing about the racialization of diseases that I would encounter an actual image of a disease. That's the coronavirus, if you are confused. And it's phenotypically, stereotypically marked with quote unquote, Black phenotypes, right? So a bunch of exaggerated characteristics. And that flag, if you don't know, is the South African flag. So this is a reference in time to when the Omicron variant of COVID-19 was discovered. And South Africa alerted the world about its genomic sequencing. And instead of sort of recognizing South Africa for what it did, promptly, like other countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union immediately placed border control efforts against South Africa and actually multiple Southern African countries because Africa tends to be, and other racialized areas tend to be sort of grouped as one, irrespective of their geographic proximity. And so we can think about the ways in which racial and colonial logics continue to influence law and policy making. The flag in the distant shore is the EU, if you can't see that. And one of the responses to this was that the US, the European Union, and others are making decisions informed by Afrophobia, as the former president of Malawi put it. And so this fear of racialized others, their diseases, reminds us really quite powerfully how the history of diseases and responses to diseases are linked to politics of racial exclusion and other forms of subordination. The periodical that published this, of course, there was an outcry, retracted it and issued an apology, but that legacy withstands. I'm going to skip this slide on the persistence of coloniality because I'm running out of time, but I can come back to it in the Q&A. Trust me, there's a lot to say there. But what I want to move to next is just kind of talking about where we are now. And so one, it should be clear from this talk that we shouldn't divorce, decontextualize, dehistoricize global health from its governing logics. I've tried to service the role that international law has played through omission and commission in reifying racialized hierarchies of care and concern. And there are current developments that are taking place, and there have been amendments that have been adopted to the international health regulations of 2005. They have not resulted in substantial changes. There are no game-changing reforms. There are financing provisions that are included, but the loopholes, when you look at these provisions, are such that they're particularly weak, and they don't commit countries within the global north to do much of anything. And so there is lip service to equity, lip service to solidarity, but not anything that is like a hard obligation. So that's the international health regulations. As well, there's a talk of developing a treaty on pandemic preparedness. Those talks have similarly, well, actually, no, the international health regulations amendments have passed. The treaty, on the other hand, has been stuck in constant negotiations right now between December, I think the 2nd and the 6th. State parties are negotiating what exactly is going to happen. We won't know whether there's a treaty until May 2025. The most optimistic thing would be February 2025, and that's optimistic just in terms of whether there's a treaty. That's not in terms of the content and the substance of the treaty. I think that I can just say that based on what happened with the amendments, I doubt that there are going to be really robust provisions in the pandemic treaty. And so current reform efforts are not clearly pointing toward a decolonial future, even if we don't know what the final treaty text is. The reality in global health is that the more things change, the more they tend to stay the same. And it's nice to imagine that there's some tidy legal solution and promise of a better tomorrow, which leads to continued investment in the creation of more and more and generation of more and more law. And then again, law construction in and of itself is looked at too as a benefit, irrespective of what the material realities of peoples are around the globe. And so it's important that we pay attention to this elephant in the room, how power and wealth are structuring and determining whose lives are going to be silently sacrificed, and how these aspects of global health continue to be a major issue, and law is not enough to address all of these things. But it is imperative that we pay attention to the health priorities of people of the global majority and consider how our relative positions have informed our different health priorities, and that if global health is going to make a change, it has to do that. Otherwise, the field really just risk reinscribing the functioning of imperial power and reifying the subaltern position of those who have historically lacked and continue to lack lawmaking power. I'll stop there. Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I say you are welcome to respond.
Thank you very, very much. That was very brilliant. I enjoyed listening to every bit of it. I'd read the paper, but as I'm sure you know, it was way greater in in delivery than in the paper itself. So well done. Thank you very much. There was an expression, I think, in the opening paragraph of the paper, which you also uttered just now, about omission and commission. And it's an expression that interests me very deeply, in part because of our tendency to pretend that we do not know what we know. Or, in fact, the ways in which the structures that govern the world direct us to not know what we should otherwise know. And when I think about global health as a field, I'm often asking myself, why isn't what we just presented now the standard understanding of how global health is and how global health works? Because if it was, we will function differently. And it isn't. And it isn't for a reason, many of which you're already highlighted, that there is something about power that works hand in hand with a kind of ignorance or knowing or unawareness. And that interests me very deeply. There's also something about power that allows the legitimization of what you described very, very eloquently as the zone of sacrifice. The normalization of that in itself is not natural. That we accept that some lives are fungible is not natural. It was created, and it was created through interpretive technologies, including race and others. And again, our unknowing of that, in other words, to normalize those things is to not know or choose to not know that these things were created and they're fictions, they're not real, but we function as though they are real, and there's something inherent in the field that makes us behave that way. There's a way in which Latin American scholars often describe coloniality, sort of in three forms: genocide, ecocide, and epistemicide. And of those three, I'm drawn particularly to the epistemicide part of it. Because as I've described it, there's something necessary in the epistemic domain for the first two to really work. In other words, to make ecocide and genocide really work effectively, you have to have done something epistemically, whether again it's in developing these technologies of interpretation, or whether it's in the ways in which people choose to not know things. You have to have done something there, and that interests me very deeply. Now, on the one hand, one may think of epistemicide as the destruction of indigenous knowledge systems, which again is necessary to make global health function the way it does. But one could also think of epistemicide in the ways that I've just described, which is a kind of injustice done to people in their capacity as knowers. Whether it's in the ways in which they want to interpret reality, which of course will divert significantly from the way power interprets reality, or whether it's in the respect we give to their accounts of reality, of their reality of the world, or their place in it. And again, when I think a lot about global health, whether it's in research or practice or in law, as you described really brilliantly, you find these forms of injustice manifest, the credibility deficit visited upon people who are at the periphery. And as you described, they are not allowed to even call on their customs as a way of making sense of the world, because of course it's not there, or if it's there, it is invalid. Or that they're not allowed, in fact, to center their own reality in the interpretation of how they want to see the world functional. And what I'm going to do in the next sort of 5-6 minutes is to go through 6 sets of conditions that I've identified as allowing these epistemic injustices to persist in global health. And one of them, the chief of them, which I hinted at already, is miseducation. It's in the fact that we have designed a field and designed a world in which we do not educate people on the most basic essentials of how to understand the world, whether it's the structural origins and the colonial legacies that underpin a lot of what we take for granted. Whether in understanding, in fact, that inequities are not biomedical, technological problems. And again, you very, very clearly described what happened in the wake of the Alma-Ata Declaration, where very quickly captured with the language of selective primary healthcare. A political vision was immediately, within 1 year, transformed into a technological vision. Again, it speaks to that kind of miseducation that we've normalized certain epistemic practices that take our attention away from the structural origin of things, which means that we are comfortable with only picking on the little things on the edges. That we will give more vaccines and you're going to be fine. We'll donate to you next year. So just wait a little bit, it will get to you. And that's those kind of really, really downstream things is where attention is often at. The second one is mislabeling. Again, very similar to miseducation. We've learned to give things labels that are false. Right? Whether it's when we mean to say racism, we say race, right? Or those kinds of things. When we mean to say that people who have been structurally disadvantaged, we just put a label of vulnerable on them as though they are by nature vulnerable. Again, which you described really well. The third one is something I call under governance. And the image of those white men in that room that you depicted is just a great representation of that. That it's who gets to sit around the table to make the rules that govern how a field functions or how efforts to address injustices and inequities function. And which leads to the fourth condition, which is underrepresentation. It's one thing to not be represented on the tables, around the tables where decisions are made. It's another thing to not have the rules and to be able to monitor and enforce them in ways that actually allow governance to function properly. So representation is one thing, making the rules that are enforceable is another one, again, which you describe really well with the regimes in international law, which are in fact not laws, because often they are things that we, in a very gentlemanly way, accept that, people are going to abide by, but screw people up in the long run, regardless. The fifth one is what I call compounded spoils. In other words, the more you have, the more you tend to have. And the people who have managed to set these rules for global health, beginning in the mid-19th century, as you described, continue to have the power to keep making them. And of course, if you set the stage, and you make it so that it's difficult to undo, the stage remains yours regardless. And that is often, again, what we see in how you've described international law and the whiteness that really underpins it. And the final one, which for me is a particularly painful one, is what I call colonial mentality. What Fela Kuti, the Nigerian singer, calls colo mentality. And it's the sense that many of us in the periphery get to believe these things to be truth. And in our believing them to be true, we are de-optimized from fighting them. Which again is part of that epistemic structure, that if you want to make a people not fight you, make them believe in their own inferiority or in the superiority of your superiority, so that of course they accept reality as given. And I think these 6 conditions, miseducation, mislabeling, undergovernance, underrepresentation, compounded spoils, and colonial mentality, are things that trouble me personally. And I keep asking myself, how do we unpick and undo these things? And in many ways, I'd like to begin with miseducation. And I'm grateful, Matiangai, that you have in fact done a lot of work in undoing that miseducation. And I hope the kind of analysis you present and the kind of storytelling, in fact, of the origins and the legacies of colonialism in global health becomes standard in how we understand global health. And that the ways in which we think about what really is our work which is not downstream. That belongs to other people. Public health people will do downstream things. Our job, the way I interpret it, is to do the upstream things. And if we can really focus our attention there, I think we will be much more successful. But that will require a lot of fight. And I'm sure we are up for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seye. So we have, I'm not keeping the queue. We have a mic that Virginia will walk around with. And so I'm trying not to walk away from the,
Matiangai, I think you can see if any questions.
oh yeah, so yes, so there's a question in the chat. And I'll just read it so that everybody can hear. So thank you for this very thoughtful and insightful talk. Can we talk about what's happening in Palestine, the genocide in Gaza that is sponsored and funded by the US, why there's been a normalized systematic silence and silencing censorship across academic global health centers and public health and medicine at large, all whom less than a few years ago ostensibly centered decolonization and equity in their work. Thank you so much for surfacing that. So yeah, I have some thoughts. I can go to you just because I've taken up a lot of time to see if you want to start.
I have another thought as well, and I'm reluctant to tell the full story of my engagement with this issue. But let's just say that I've been shocked myself personally about the reluctance and the fear that people have in confronting the genocide in Gaza. I've been shocked because institutions that I had previously believed to be strong, 200, 300-year-old institutions, are suddenly afraid to just say one sentence or two sentences, are afraid to publish things, and I'm speaking here of academic journals, and NGOs in global health are afraid to make a statement. And what I found troubling in a lot of this also is the way in which we excuse ourselves. Again, going epistemic briefly, in that either it's too complex, you can't have a position. I don't think there's anything complex about the genocide. Genocide is a genocide, you call it a genocide, and you advocate for it to stop. Or whether it's the fact that something bad is going to happen to us. We will lose our funding, we will lose our reputation, we will have a huge blowback. But for me, what all of that signal, personally for me, is imagine that we are at the middle, right? And there's this force asking us to not speak up, to not advocate, to not campaign. And that on the other end from us are people who are suffering. To take the force that is asking us to keep quiet too seriously is to say that we agree that some people are worthy of being sacrificed. Again, using Matangai's phrase, that it's okay, we can look away from that. And what happens when you look away is that you lose your soul. There's something, you damage your own soul, regardless of how impactful. And again, another excuse is that whatever we say will not change anything. But my comeback for that is always to say, if you keep quiet, you will justify your keeping quiet. When you justify your keeping quiet, you justify that certain lives are worth less than others. Certain lives are worth being sacrificed. And when you do that, you destroy your own soul. So even if only to preserve your own soul, whether as individuals or as institutions, it is worth speaking up. And I've been shocked personally that people and institutions have chosen to be quiet about this matter.
Thank you for that, Seye. And I would just add, I mean, I think you have said, you've expressed the disappointment. I am not someone who has been silent on this. But I think it's important also to think about, again, how we think about who matters and who does not in terms of the zones of sacrifice. Even when we think about like norms that exist in international law around protection of health facilities, around protection of doctors, around norms against displacement, norms against targeting of civilian objects. And all of those things is as if those norms sort of fade from existence because everything we are to understand is has a mixed use. It's in international law, you can target military objectives and you can target you, but you can't target civilian objectives. And so if everything is a mixed use, a civilian and military, it makes what would otherwise not be allowable. And so we've seen really, I think, stretching of the use of every single health facility, every single target. And this is in the context of 80% or 70% rather of all civilian infrastructure in Gaza being destroyed, including schools and the like. And so thinking again about the ways in which global health actors, institutions, and individuals have been not vocal enough about this. It is sort of surfacing a number of the logics that we've been talking about in this talk in terms of who is, where the zones of sacrifice are, and what is allowable. So thank you for that. I don't know if we have time for any other questions.
So if people have to go, we understand, but I think if we could just have a question or two while we have these two wonderful experts here on this topic. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask in the room?
Thank you to you both. This was absolutely brilliant for someone who thinks about these things and hear about this issue in different contexts. It was pretty moving. So I'll say that. One of the things that you said struck me, and I had some questions related to it, or some thoughts that came from it. And it was the conversation about the ways in which IMF works with these neoliberal assumptions and agendas, and the sort of the slimming of the public health sector, and that visual was very, very powerful too. But it made me think about, especially because much of some of the harms and deficiencies that some of these countries and barriers that the countries are wrestling with are caused by those very same, countries in the global minority or global north, right? And it made me think about sort of post-Haitian revolution and sort of the structure there where, Haiti was paying reparations to France for the destruction and dehumanization and violence that it caused, right? So it made me think about, one, to what extent, if you know, is think about reparations. Is global health in terms of international organizing and movement thought of, focused on in a push for global reparations movement? And I'm also thinking in the decolonization movement that has been proliferating over recent years on the ground and also in academic circles. To what extent is global health a focus there?
Thanks for that. I'll just repeat it. And briefly, it's just thinking about how to repair this legacy and ongoing nature of injustices within global health. And as you rightfully said, there were never any reparations for however many centuries of colonialism. There were never any reparations for slavery. Haiti had to pay for its freedom, which informs its current positionality today. And this idea that you don't have to repair the harms is part of this construction, this epistemic construction that Seye was just talking about in terms of what is within the bounds of what is reasonable and what is outside of the bounds of what is reasonable. And there's a way in which law has an integral role to play in sort of constructing legal fictions around, well, what was legal then? I mean, I started by talking about how law was structured and created in ways that did not recognize the legal systems and ways and systems of being and governance of peoples all over, such that when you say, well, it wasn't illegal then, it's like, well, who to who, right? To who? whose systems are you looking at, right? Whose systems are you looking at, and who was being asked that? Did the people who were being enslaved think that slavery was legal? Did the people, indigenous peoples whose lands were being taken and who were being genocided, they did think that that was legal? And so it's important to think about, again, legal fictions and the ways in which we construct norms about legality and norms around sort of statute of limitations and other things which leave out thinking about rectifying colonialism, thinking about rectifying slavery, thinking about rectifying numerous genocides. So that's the world that's the international order that we exist in. And then against that background, global health doesn't have any element really of a redistributive agenda to fix that reality. And in fact, all of the efforts that are linked to sort of distributing burden sharing accordingly, such that you are disaggregating burdens such that those who have benefited from the material extraction from the global south do more and pay more through a principle called a common but differentiated responsibility, have been sort of whittled out of negotiations. That principle would have required richer countries to take on higher obligations, financing, and others to address pandemic preparedness, prevention, and response, and would have required more efforts and resources for building up health infrastructure and the like. And as I mentioned, the current financial assistance provisions and technology transfer positions and the like are all pretty watered down. Efforts through the COVID-19 pandemic to led by India and South Africa to try to get a waiver of patents because pharmaceutical patents because of the nature of COVID-19 and relief for diagnostics, including tests, therapeutics, treatment, and the like. That effort was also watered down, and when the final decision came, it didn't really address the call that South Africa and India were making for greater access to essential medicines. And so the inequity is actually literally baked into the system. It's baked into our legal regime. And it's important to surface the role that law is playing in maintaining inequality and allowing, again, zones of sacrifice. And I think COVID-19 is a good illustration of thinking about, who the vulnerable is, because COVID-19 constructed the elderly and other people as zones of sacrifice. And not knowing that COVID-19, meanwhile, all along, is something that is sacrificing all of us over the long term. And you would have thought that that would have been an opportunity for us to rectify the way in which we approach global health, right? Recognizing that our health, we only really have this life. We only really have this body. And despite our efforts to think that we can govern and rule everything, when we are faced with our individual health, we are faced with our individual mortality and our collective mortality, as well as our reduction in the quality of life that we have. And once that is gone, it's hard to replace. And so there needs to be a shift within global health that is thinking on redistributive lines. And that is not at all what's happening within the current reforms. And so I have to say that I'm not sort of optimistic that the current reform efforts are going to lead to anti-subordination or reparative efforts. But I think that that is part of the fight. Part of the fight, as Seye was mentioning, is like not normalizing it, not normalizing that there should be no repair, that there is no recompense that is due, and that there are zones of sacrifice and peoples whose lives are meaningless, and contesting that and fighting that. Seye, I don't know if you had anything else to conclude.
No, nothing really to add. That was very well answered. For me, part of the challenge is finding is how alternative concepts are used instead of things like reparation. So you hear solidarity, or you hear things like that that sort of suggest that let's all come together. We are the same, and let's not talk about those things that they are in the past. It's now, and we want to save lives now. So there are very brilliant tools, epistemic tools that are used to diffuse claims about reparation, discussions about redistribution. And again, it's being attentive to those things and being attentive to them in ways that immediately challenge their legitimacy as appropriate concepts to use in those kind of discussions.
So we are way over time. Thank you guys for being with us today. Thank you so much, Seye. It's like 7:30, I think, in Australia.
So it's now 9 a.m. So it's good now. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. We'll stop the recording. Thank you, Seye. We'll be in touch. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.